Welcome, everybody, to this episode of Addressing Winchester, and I'm joined today by Jonathan Noyalas. We're going to be discussing his newest book, pictured here, The Blood Tinted Waters of the Shenandoah. I'm going to go ahead and give you Jonathan's official introduction from his book because I think those are well crafted and give you everything you need to hear. So, Jonathan Noyalas is a history professor at Shenandoah University and director of its McCormick Civil War Institute. He is the author or editor of 15 books and has published more than 100 articles, chapters, essays, and reviews in a variety of popular and scholarly publications, including the Civil War Times, America's Civil War Monitor, and Civil War History. Noyalas has appeared on NPR's With Good Reason, PCN, and C-SPAN. Noyalas is the recipient of numerous awards for his teaching and scholarship, including Shenandoah University's Exemplary Teaching Award for the first year seminar, Shenandoah's Wilkins Award, and the State Council for Higher Education and Virginia's Outstanding Faculty Award. So that is quite the list, my friend. And I also have been a student of Jonathan's. Attended many of his lectures over the years. Probably you're the first person that ever gave me like an adult tour of the Battle of Gettysburg. Or I don't know if you knew that. I went as a kid and did like the crammed in the back seat as a 10-year-old tour. But when you did a morning July 3rd Culp's Hill chat up there with the McCormick Institute when you were at Shannon or at Lord Fairfax, now Laurel Ridge. This is probably 2011, so sometime.
Mhm.
And a big part of my passion in the battle now. So,
Yeah.
uh, Jonathan, tell me, we got your book here. We're talking about it. The what people don't know is the university essentially acquired a battlefield in 2013, this Cool Spring battlefield, and tell me how you were brought into that and your role in that.
Yeah. So, I mean, I really attribute my coming to Shenandoah University from Lord Fairfax, which, as you said, is now Laurel Ridge, attributed it to the Cool Spring battlefield. So, Shenandoah University in 2013, after the American Battlefield Trust preserved the property, the trust, gifted it to Shenandoah. And Shenandoah, of course, became the steward of that land, the 195-acre parcel. But one of the stipulations of that agreement was that the university had to do something with it, right? And so had to interpret it, offer educational programs, open it up to the public. And so the following year, 2014 was the 150th anniversary of the Battle of Cool Spring. And so I was invited to come as a visiting professor. And, it was during my time as visiting professor. That's when you were a student at Shenandoah,
Yes.
sitting there in my classroom. And so I came as visiting professor, and I thought it was a one and done deal. Come for a semester, teach a class, do a program that summer. Actually, it was a joint program between the university and the National Park Service. One of my former students, Shannon Moak, worked with me on that. And I thought, I'd go do this and it'd be done. And then they invited me back for another semester and another semester. And eventually it turned into an invitation to come there full time in January of 2017.
Absolutely. And you're kind of working chronologically backwards, in the 1864 campaigns, because you started at, now Laurel Ridge, where you were one of the early, helped interpret it and develop a lot of the stuff for the Battle of Cedar Creek up there, where the Middletown campus sits smack dab in the middle of the battlefield. Do you have any comments, to that? Does your time up there help you study, some of these divisions and units better? Or do you feel like they're separate entities?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of the same units that a lot of the same people who are at Cedar Creek in October of 1864 are at the Battle of Cool Spring. And so certainly, my time at Lord Fairfax, and in particular, working with the National Park Service, I was part of a historical research team working on their historic resource study. And so that really was, a really important part of the early part of my career, kind of shaping how I thought about the Valley. And in
Around
particular,
around 2009 or so, is that when that takes place? Or
it was, yeah, about that time that my son was born. So about 2009, somewhere in
well,
there.
another Gettysburg connection. When Eric comes down here from Gettysburg, I mean, Cedar Creek does not have a long history, so they needed all hands on deck to develop
Yeah.
and interpret that site. So
Yeah. Yeah, I remember giving Eric a tour of Cedar Creek when I used to run programs through Lord Fairfax, and he was like, "There's no monuments here." So it's like it was so much easier when I was at Gettysburg. I wanted to do a program on 11 Pennsylvania. I can go up to Oak Ridge, and there it is. But it's a little bit more difficult when you're in the valley because those fields are not marked like they are at Gettysburg.
Absolutely, and having a large Gettysburg crossover audience and a lot of folks that want to take the license guide test in Gettysburg, that's why I want to talk about this battle because there's a tremendous amount of crossover on both sides between the Confederate Second Corps and, of course, Union Sixth Corps, and Crook taking over in the Eighth Corps. There's a lot of familiar faces. So, when it pertains to this book, what was the genesis of this? Did you have the idea? Were you approached from this is a Savas Beatie emerging Civil War combo? How does that come together?
Yeah, so this book really, I mean, it grows out of years of research, not just my own research, but with research with students. So, when I came to Shenandoah and was really tasked with researching this battle, interpreting the site, putting signs up, all the sort of typical things that you would see at a Civil War site. I thought that we had a unique opportunity to do something at Cool Spring, maybe that no other battlefield does have the opportunity to do. And that is to look at the background of every single Union or Confederate soldier who was killed there or
Mhm.
mortally wounded there. And so, you take a battle like Gettysburg where you have, thousands and thousands and thousands of guys die. I mean, you could do it, but that would be like your life's work. At Cool Spring, you have about 150, 160 guys who die. And so it still takes a lot of time to look through pensions records and widows' pension files and, regimental returns and all those types of things. But we were able to really gain a picture of the Battle of Cool Spring deeper than tactical maneuver, tactical movements and strategic decisions and those types of things. And so, for me, Civil War history has always been about the human experience,
Mhm.
and not to knock, looking at tactical decisions or strategic decisions and all that kind of stuff. That's all important. But my training as a historian, going back to my days at Shenandoah and also graduate school in Virginia Tech, studying with the great Bud Robertson and Jack Davis, was really to emphasize the human experience, to look at the broader impact of war on soldiers and their families. And so, the deeper I began to dig into this, again with the help of some of my students researching the backgrounds of these soldiers, I thought there's much more to this story than just, this is what happened on July 17th and 18th. And, there was a booklet that was put out, back in the early 80s, late 70s, early 80s about Cool Spring. And it, kind of really offered a great overview of the battle, but really wasn't deep and penetrating. Like, what does this mean to the guys who were involved? And so I also knew that if I did a study of this battle, it wouldn't be a 500 or 600 page doorstopper of a book. It's just not there. So I began to think about publishers who might be interested. Chris Mikowski, of course, is a good friend of mine, good supporter. I've worked with him on different things over the years. And so I reached out and asked if Emerging Civil War would be interested in doing a book on Cool Spring. And I know, again, it kind of didn't fit. They hadn't really offered anything about smaller engagements before, but I kind of pitched it to Chris Mikowski and Savas Beatie that this is a battle that you can learn more than just about the battle, right? So you can learn about how it impacts soldiers in the short term, the long term, widows, orphans, and how you can really think about how the environment impacts war. One of the things that I write about in the book is the Union pursuit of Jubal Early's men out of Washington, D.C. Horatio Wright, of course, leads that pursuit, leaves Washington on July 13th at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And it takes, a good 4 days to get the lead elements to get to Snickers Gap. And, I've had people on tours at Cool Spring. They're like, well, if I was in charge, I would have moved that army a lot more quickly. And I'm like, have you looked at weather reports? It's as hot as it is now. So, we're in the Shenandoah Valley. It's like 100 degrees plus, and it has been for many days, and it's really dry. And so, I wanted to bring environmental factors into this. And again, to help people understand that when you're studying a battle, interpreting a battle, it's more than the blue blocks or the red blocks on a map. I mean, these are human beings as we are. And I think we have to take that into consideration. So that's really the whole genesis for this book. And I'm grateful to Chris and to Ted Savas for agreeing to support this project because this is not just telling the history of the battle in a very intimate way. And I think kind of maybe reshaping the way that people might think about a battlefield. I mean, all the proceeds from this book come back to the Civil War Institute to help us support our programs and future scholarship at Cool Spring as well.
Yeah, and that's something to reiterate to everybody listening. Though, when you do buy the book, you know, all the proceeds are going right back to the institute. This is something to support real in the field learning at a really cool campus site that I'm not sure we even broke all the way into here. The River Campus site is kind of unique in the sense that, as far as the way Shenandoah uses it, it's half an environmental studies area and also half a history site. Correct? And you want to go into a
Right.
little bit how it operates?
Yeah, so it's our environmental studies program makes great use of the property. I mean, it truly is a hands-on learning environment. The history program, in particular, you know, what I do with the Civil War Studies program, it's an outdoor laboratory. You know, teaching students how to interpret a historic site, um, how to write wayside markers, how to develop walking tours, how to kind of layer interpretation. I mean, everything that we have physically produced out there um, has in some way come from the work of my students. So we have you know, during COVID when we were all locked down and couldn't do anything, we actually put together, you know, 8, 9 minute interpretive video
Hmm.
that we have on our website now, and we work with different people at the university, kind of, you know, technologically make it happen. But it's really a great opportunity to give students that real world experience, not just an academic exercise, like, you know, write this paper, write this sign, and then it just goes away. But they're developing stuff for public consumption.
Yeah, and doing real, public history, going through the motions to giving tours and stuff. And as someone that, went through a history undergrad program before that existed, jealous of, and something, if you're a parent out there listening to this, you have a student that's into history, into the Civil War thing, Gettysburg College on your list, look into Shenandoah as well, because, there's some stuff going on there that's really important. So,
Mhm.
as far as the battle, let's place it. The Battle of Cool Springs, it exists in this greater Valley 1864, which essentially is kind of like three smaller campaigns. But let's talk what happens here. Grant's elevated, he's brought east, famous, Grant's brought east. Can
Mhm.
you speak to that? What Lincoln's thinking, and what changes when Grant comes east as far as this, move on all fronts directive that's kind of new?
Yeah, so you're right. So when Grant becomes general in chief in March of 1864, he essentially wants to move all Union forces as if they're one massive army, you know, pressuring the Confederacy at all points simultaneously. And of course, as we know, things don't go all that well in the early spring of 64. You know, Franz Sigel doesn't perform all that well in the valleys, defeat at Newmarket. You know, the Red River campaign doesn't go all that well for General Banks. And so, you look at things, and as you get throughout that summer and you get to that point, after the Overland campaign, when you get to, mid-June, and, Grant makes this decision that he's going to go, try to take Richmond from the south by way of Petersburg. And then you have, this stalemate that's really going to develop in front of Petersburg. Robert E. Lee is trying to figure out, how do I break this?
Hmm.
And so Lee does what he did, 2 years earlier. He looks to the Shenandoah Valley as a diversionary theater of war. What Stonewall Jackson was doing in the Shenandoah Valley in the spring of 1862 was to create a diversion, to threaten invasion of the North, threaten the capital in Washington, D.C., in order to draw Union forces away from Richmond. And so it worked in the spring of 1862. Leah ultimately was hoping that it would work, late spring, early summer of 1864. So he cuts loose, Jubal Early's Second Corps. That Second Corps, moves from Petersburg to Lynchburg. They drive David Hunter out of Lynchburg. Hunter goes all the way into, West Virginia, and ultimately will make his way up to Harper's Ferry. And then Early starts cutting his way north through the Shenandoah Valley into Maryland, and then heading toward the gates of Washington, D.C. And so, when Early gets to the gates of Washington on July the 11th, he stays there for 2 days. The following day, he retreats. But one of the things that ultimately is critical for this, and I was just at the Lincoln Cottage speaking at a symposium last week about what all the stuff that's happening in the summer of 1864. What does this mean for Lincoln? And one of the points I made at the Lincoln Cottage Symposium, and I make in the book, is that this was really a sobering moment for President Lincoln. And so, there's all kind of criticism that the president confronts. How can you let a Confederate army, however large it is? And of course, Early had 15,000 men, but newspaper accounts were all over the place. I mean, some newspapers had Early's army as high as 40 or 45,000 men. Okay, and so there was this pandemonium among many people in Washington. I mean, Jubal Early, very famously, if you can believe Henry Kidd Douglas, said that as they were retreating from or withdrawing from Washington, he said, "We haven't taken Washington, but we've scared Abe Lincoln like hell." And I think, looking at Lincoln and particularly people around him who knew him, people like John Nicolay, John Hay, members of his cabinet, writing in that moment, not years after the fact, but in that moment, I don't think Lincoln was scared like hell. I think he was aggravated that Early had gotten there. And I think that was a sobering moment for Lincoln to realize that the situation in Virginia is not going to be resolved unless you are able to secure the Shenandoah Valley. And so, that pursuit or that push from the Confederates to Washington, the subsequent pursuit, and what ultimately, becomes the Battle of Cool Spring, these are all important events that lead to the ascendancy of General Philip Sheridan as commander of what we know famously as the Army of the Shenandoah. I mean, just, July 25th is when Ulysses S. Grant makes the decision first and foremost, okay, we have to consolidate all of these different departments that are responsible for the protection of Washington. We have to consolidate them into one, go after Early and defeat him, because otherwise I'm just going to be continuously distracted from trying to, achieve that ultimate goal of the destruction of the Army of Northern Virginia.
100%. And 62 and Jackson always kind of gets all the attention, but I mean, Early does a longer, farther, substantially longer campaign the early part of the summer there, where he's moving around and really causing some havoc. And
yeah, people don't realize, and people I mean, Jackson is much more popular, right, than Jubal Early. But people don't realize, I mean, Jackson, he marches close to 700 miles, all throughout the Valley campaign. So that's, from March into, mid-June of 1862. Jubal Early's army within the first month, so from mid-June until the time they get to Cool Spring, they put on about 500 miles already.
and that's after the Overland campaign, not exactly a break.
Yeah, yeah, and in much more horrific, weather conditions as well, I would argue. And so, yeah, it's really an amazing thing when you look at the amount of miles they cover, and the conditions they cover, what that Confederate force is able to achieve. And then you kind of fast forward a little bit to like mid-September, late September of 1864. The Confederates are loving Jubal Early in the summer until you get to 3rd Winchester and Fisher's Hill. And they're like, we want him gone, replace him. I mean, particularly after the Battle of Fisher's Hill. I mean, there are Confederates in the Valley, residents of the Valley, calling for Jubal Early's removal, offering, suggestions to Jefferson Davis, replace him with John Breckinridge. So he falls out of favor quite quickly within the Confederacy once he starts losing
Sure.
in the autumn of 64.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, Early's fascinating, 100%. Then even the way he's handled after Waynesboro and Lee's so kind of he's almost soft with him, and he's
Yeah.
in the Early still kind of asking for a command, and Lee's like, I can't do anything. You're probably the hottest potato in the army right now. We got to get you out of here. So yeah, Early's fascinating, and then ends his whole foray with the at Cedar Creek with the surprise attack where he's just like smashing into an army that's whooped them all fall. So definitely interesting stuff. But going back to outside of Washington D.C., the pinnacle that's this Fort Stevens moment where Confederates, what would you say, about 5 or 6 miles from the Capitol? I mean, they're right there and really scaring some folks. They pull out, and you talk in the book about stealing a day's march on their way back into the valley. And this brings us to kind of the Union command that takes shape around the battle. Do you mind speaking to Horatio Wright and the commander of the
Yeah.
Civil War and kind of his reputation and personality?
Yeah, sure. So, one of the points that I make in the book is that, Lincoln wanted an immediate pursuit.
Mm-hmm.
Once the Confederates were gone, he wanted immediately to follow. The problem was that there was not a singular person in command of all of those different forces responsible for the protection of Washington. And Lincoln understood that there was only one person who could appoint a commander of all of those forces, and that was Ulysses S. Grant. And, even though Lincoln was commander in chief, Lincoln promised something to Grant in March of 1864 when he appointed him to that post. And he said, I will not interfere in your command decisions. I will not make any military decisions unless, there was one caveat, unless you delay significantly. So, when I read that, I'm thinking like McClellan-like delays.
Yeah, yeah.
And so I think in the grand scheme of things, Grant responded quickly. He appointed Horatio Wright, who was the commander of the Sixth Corps, replacing Sedgwick, of course. And he has, of all the commanders available to him, I think he has a great amount of trust in Horatio Wright. So Horatio Wright, begins this pursuit. It takes, 4 days for his, lead elements to get to Snicker's Gap. And of course, when Horatio Wright's force gets, and again, by the time Horatio Wright's lead elements get to Snicker's Gap on July 17th, he has, about 30,000 men under his command. So he's pulling from Hunter's Army of West Virginia. And he, of course, has, troops from the 6th Corps, the 19th Corps as well are part of this. And so Horatio Wright, who I argue does not want to be in charge of this pursuit, does not want to be in the Valley. And this is not just coming from, my studies of Cool Spring, but the Shenandoah Valley in 1864 more broadly. I think he wanted to be at Petersburg because I think that's where he felt he was going to get the greatest amount of attention. And so Horatio Wright, he is, I think hearing different things from different people, right? So Lincoln wants Jubal Early destroyed. Grant and Halleck essentially are saying, just make sure the threat is eliminated. So what does that really ultimately mean? And so Horatio Wright, pushes. There's some fighting at Castleman's Ferry. So, for your listeners who are familiar with the Valley, where Route 7 crosses over the Shenandoah River, that's essentially Castleman's Ferry. So there's, cavalry fighting that happens all throughout there on the 17th. Union cavalry under Alfred Dufay are not able to drive the Confederates. John B. Gordon's men are defending Castleman's Ferry. They're not able to drive them from that position. They try early that morning, the following day, July the 18th, and then ultimately, the plans begin to change.
Sure. So yeah, that brings us up to, the day of the 18th. There's this meeting that you talk about in the book between Crook and Wright. So what kind of happens in the meeting? What's the strategy that they devise there?
Yeah. So what they come up with, Crook was the one who really, I think, should get the credit for developing this plan that it ultimately doesn't play out. But he, saw the final cavalry attack. He saw the 22nd Pennsylvania Cavalry, moving down the slopes toward the Shenandoah, and it was just another futile effort. And so Crook had this idea to launch a flank attack. So move about a mile north, downstream, and then come through pathways in the Blue Ridge Mountains, come across property that's actually owned by Shenandoah University today, the retreat, cross the Shenandoah River at Island Ford, and then turn south, and then flank the Confederate position.
Sure.
So, Wright and Crook, they confer about this. Wright approves it. And the task of making the flank attack falls upon the shoulders of Colonel Joseph Thoburn. So Thoburn, with his division and the addition of Colonel Daniel Frost's brigade, so he has about 5,000 men roughly. They're going to move, through the mountains. They're going to come down by Judge Richard Parker. So this is the same Judge Parker who presided over John Brown's trial. He owned the retreat, and then come up to Island Ford. What is so interesting about this to me, and I write about this in the book, and this is something that has always intrigued me about this march, is the person who led them on the march.
Yeah, this is interesting. Yeah, go
And
into.
so, yeah, the guy who leads them his name was John Kerrigan. And, for many, many years, the identity of this guy was sort of elusive. There were little clues here and there. And that was one of the things I committed to when I was writing this book, that I need to figure out, what's the story with this guy. And so John Kerrigan was born in New York City. He ended up living in, near Castleman's Ferry for decades prior to the Civil War. He was in his mid 40s when the Civil War broke out. He worked as a tailor. When the Civil War began, he enlisted as a musician in the 2nd Virginia. So 2nd Virginia Infantry ultimately becomes part of the famed Stonewall Brigade. He stays in that regiment till March the 11th, 1862, which for those of your listeners who are really, interested in Shenandoah Valley history, know that is the day that Stonewall Jackson evacuates Winchester. So Jackson is moving south and John Kerrigan is moving north into Maryland. He deserts. What happens to him for about the next 2 years, we don't know, but he ends up showing up in Monrovia, Maryland, ends up enlisting as the chief musician of the 3rd Maryland Potomac Home Brigade. And so he is part of this Union pursuit force in the summer of 1864. And what's unclear, we don't have any of John Kerrigan's writings. Unfortunately, he had a very, very tormented life after the war. He did come back to Clark County. He ended up committing suicide in the mid part of the 1880s. So I mean, we don't even know where he's buried. So we don't know if John Kerrigan, volunteered his services or if somebody knew that he was from there. My guess would be that he volunteered, because how would you know? Like if you're Horatio Wright, how would you know that this guy was from here? But nonetheless, John Kerrigan, his friends called him Barney, led him through these mountain paths, got them to Island Ford, and Colonel Thoburn was fully expecting that when they got to the crossing, it would be uncontested and they could just turn south and attack the Confederates, and it would be all, they would achieve their objective. The problem was that it was not an uncontested crossing. So there were elements of 2 Virginia regiments, the 42nd and 50th Virginia, who were at that crossing. There's a small fight that breaks out between troops from Colonel George Welles's brigade, which was the lead brigade in Thoburn's command. And after it's all said and done, those Virginians are driven off. About 16 of them are captured. And Colonel Thoburn begins to question these Confederate prisoners of war. And what he learns really startles him. It causes him a lot of angst. He learns that, aside from the Confederates who are at Castleman's Ferry, Robert Rhodes' division is nearby. Gabriel Wharton's division is nearby. Jubal Early's, only several miles west in Berryville. And so he petitions General Crook. He's like, this is not good. 5,000 guys here. We have, probably 2 or 3 times that number right in front of me or close to me. We have a river between us and the rest of the Union force. Can I withdraw? And Crook says no. He says, stay put, but don't launch the flank attack. Just put your men in battle array. And so, grudgingly, Thoburn, looks at the contours of the landscape. And Cool Spring, the battlefield is interesting that it slopes up from the river. And so he puts his men basically in 2 main lines. There's a line right along the riverbank, another line about 75 yards up, and then beyond that is a line of skirmishers. So yeah,
one of the maps, the old map from the Civil War Trust, but you can kind of get a feel for the river has 2 distinct islands in it, and then kind of some of the obstacles you're talking about, the environmental impact on the battle. It's a tricky topography for sure. But keep going there. You're talking.
Yeah, and one of the other things that I want to mention here while we're just talking about the deployments is the river crossing. And so, when you think about crossing the Shenandoah River in, mid-July of 1864, you have drought conditions in the valley. It had not rained for weeks, intensely hot. And so, soldiers who are writing about this crossing, they're writing about, the water comes up to knee, maybe mid-thigh, depending on your height. But one of the things I write about in the book is how that crossing, even once the immediate threat from those Virginians was eliminated, that the crossing still posed challenges. So one of the stories that I write about, and this is something that was told to me years ago by a great historian friend of mine, John Eric Galat, so I want to give him credit for this, involved a soldier in the 170th Ohio. His name was John Goundy. And John Goundy, as he was crossing the river, his foot got stuck in something. And it was wedged in there pretty, severely. where he and his buddies were trying to yank out his leg. Ultimately, they ended up rupturing his groin. Infection set in, gangrene, and he ended up dying from that, a couple months after the Battle of Cool Spring. And there are other similar stories of guys, getting sick or getting injured during that crossing. So again, it's a reminder, right, to people when they look at not only Cool Spring but all Civil War battles, that you have multiple enemies. So the obvious is the guy who is shooting at you, Union and Confederate. But I know people think about disease all the time, but Mother Nature's a tremendous enemy for these soldiers as well. I mean, people, will oftentimes complain about Civil War soldiers, letters, they're not providing enough of battle content. They're writing about the weather all the time. I'm like, that's because that's the thing that impacts them the most. I mean, what do we talk about all the time? It's dry, it's cold, it's hot, it's wet. I mean, it's human nature.
100%. Yeah, that's another thing to bring up here. When you're reading this book, it's not particularly long. It's what, about 170 pages, all out through the back. And what you do so well is it's not something where you're going to get like bogged down in units and tactical stuff. That's in there. You're going to get your Civil War history, but these little composites of the key players from the private level up through the command level, how they fared the battle, maybe how their life was after the war. You tell stories of brothers that have tragedy in the conflict. I mean, it is truly a human interest story as much as is a battle story, and I think that's something that you do very well throughout the entire book. Now, you had mentioned Thoburn. He kind of emerges as a hero of the battle, or that's the way I kind of pick it up. And can you go into there a little bit? There's some consternation between him and Ricketts' division about reinforcements once the battle really hits its crescendo. Go into that a little bit about this
Sure.
confusion.
Yeah. So, after you have this exchange between, when Thoburn is anxious, when he's anxious about, so many Confederate divisions being in his front, and, Crook tells him to stay put. Crook is okay with this until he looks out in the distance and he sees what ultimately is Gabriel Wharton's division coming closer to Island Ford. And he doesn't realize it at the time, but it's also, Robert Rhodes' division approaching that position as well. And so, Crook at that moment in time actually wanted to pull Thoburn out. And Horatio Wright said, no, leave him where he is, but we'll send support. And so the support that came in the form of General James Ricketts' division of the Sixth Corps. So Thoburn thinks support's coming. All of his men think support is coming. And then, you get to a point early on in the engagement, you're probably looking at, sometime between maybe 5:30 that evening. Ricketts' division comes down to the river, traversing the ground that's owned by Shenandoah University, and he decides not to cross. And the reason he decides not to cross is because, and if you look at that map, that far right end of the Union line, the troops who were posted there initially was a provisional brigade comprised of dismounted cavalrymen. And so these dismounted cavalrymen, about 1,000 men from 27 different regiments, commanded by Colonel Samuel Young, they are responsible for protecting that far northern end of Thoburn's line. When Robert Rhodes' division launches its attack against Thoburn's right flank, Samuel Young's command, they really don't put up much of a fight. And I told this to a group I was speaking to last week that, years ago, when I started reading about the Battle of Cool Spring and, looked at Colonel Samuel Young's detachment, his provisional brigade, I made the conclusion that a lot of people would make, that they were cowards, right? So you don't fire a lot and you retreat. Cowardice is the kind of the fallback charge here. But as you start to look more deeply at diaries and letters from guys in that command in the moment, not years after, because there's a difference in how you evaluate primary source material, it became clear that they were kind of set up for failure. So when I say dismounted cavalry, people think about, so if you think about the Battle of Gettysburg, right? And you think about Buford's men, fighting dismounted with their carbines, this is not that type of dismounted cavalry. So these are guys who lost their horses. They were organized into this provisional brigade just weeks before. And part of that reorganization involved them turning in their carbines and, taking muskets instead. And so if you are used to shooting a Sharps carbine or a Smith carbine, or luckily, if you have a Spencer carbine, and all of a sudden you're given a musket and you're told, okay, we expect you to fight as infantry, but you don't have a lot of training. When you're in an intense combat situation, when really arguably one of the best divisions in the Army of Northern Virginia is coming at you, uh, you start freaking out. So, there's one account I write of in there from Sergeant James Henry Avery, where Avery writes about how he was so flustered, he actually took the entire cartridge. So instead of separating the bullet from the powder, he took the whole cartridge and rammed it down. Well, that paper is not combustible. This is not a Johnson and Dow cartridge. And so when he went to fire, it wouldn't go off. He's like, oh crap. So throws the musket down, picks up another one, loads, fires, but then he left his ramrod leaning up against a tree and he had moved away from it. So if you don't have the ramrod, you can't load. And so this really all comes about as a result of that poor training. So if these guys can't shoot, they can't stay there and fight. And so the large majority of them, they pull back across the Shenandoah River to the east bank. And it's just as they're coming across that Ricketts and Crook are there trying to figure out where Ricketts can cross. And Ricketts looks at Young's command and he says, I don't think so. And so what ultimately ends up happening is Crook then goes to Wright, and Wright says, I fully support Ricketts' decision not to cross. I don't think ultimately that there's anything to be gained by moving his division to the other side of the river. And so this is that moment where Thoburn has to make a really important decision. And it's a moment that I think really defines him. I mean, I think Thoburn is a guy who was underrated as a commander. He should have been a brigadier general by this point in the war, but he was always overlooked. And Thoburn, says, do we retreat now or do we stay until darkness? And ultimately, they decided to remain until darkness because they would at least have the cover of night to get back across the river. And so, Thoburn's men, they fight tenaciously. They do actually have the advantage of cover because the Confederates are attacking downhill. So they're behind a stone wall that lines the Shenandoah River in kind of a depressed roadbed. There are 3 artillery batteries above them in the bluffs. And what's always amazing to me about this engagement, because this is a battle that a lot of people have never even heard of. When I was at the event in Washington on Friday, I was speaking to a gentleman, and he's like, "This is a guy who knew a lot about Fort Stevens, but had never heard about Cool Spring." I'm like, "Well, it's the end." The war doesn't end on July 12th. So, but what's amazing to me about this is when you look at the accounts from Robert Rhodes's command, how they write about the ferocity of this engagement. There was one member of Rhodes' command who wrote after the battle that it was one of the most sharp and obstinate affairs in which he had ever been engaged. And to me, that's very telling, right? So you think about the engagements that Rhodes' command had been in up until this point in the conflict, and he's regarding this as a most sharp and obstinate affair. That to me speaks volumes for the intense combat. I mean, Rhodes' command is they launch several assaults against that northern flank, and all those assaults are repulsed, which I think is remarkable.
Yeah, and you kind of point out in the book, it's a combination of the tenacity of the troops, it's the position, it's the stone wall there. I mean, they're really able to do a lot with a little, in those moments. And what goes on to happen, you mentioned in the book that, after the battle's kind of over and the guys are crossing back from Thoburn's command, there's these dialogues where men from the Sixth Corps and Ricketts Division are saying, "Hey, we wanted to come over, we wanted to assist," and then you kind of speak to it in a way that it wasn't a huge battle, but for these guys, it kind of had their Jubal early moment where for the rest of the war, they're writing and pontificating about what could have happened here, where we know Early has this legacy of being pretty prolific with the pen after the war. A lot of these guys are doing the same, discussing this small engagement. Does anything
Yeah,
stick out about that, like particular letters or kind of?
yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I think sometimes that people might forget that even though the shooting stops in 1865, um, the battle for the memory of the war, it continues on until these guys breathe their last. And so you're right. So after the battle is over, you have these interactions with Ricketts' command, and Thoburn's men are wondering, okay, you're here, you see what's happening, you're actually putting yourself in danger. I mean, there are guys, and I write about this in the book, there are guys from Ricketts' division who end up being killed by Confederate artillery shells that are trying to silence Union artillery in the bluffs. And so when people don't have a clear explanation for something, their imagination is going to kick in. And so ultimately, people's imaginations are going to turn to things like, well, this was intentional. And the chaplain of the 18th Connecticut, William Walker, he believes, and he writes about this in the regimental history, that George Crook and Horatio Wright did not get along, which is absolutely true. And if you look at, the fighting in the autumn of 1864, particularly prior to Fisher's Hill, that's borne out. So he thought that Wright intentionally held Ricketts, told him not to cross because he wanted to discredit Crook's reputation. So there are all these ideas circulating, but it was a great source of pride for the men in Thoburn's command to say, okay, we didn't tactically win the battle, right? Because we withdrew. It became a fight for survival for us. But it was a source of pride for them because they were fighting against overwhelming odds. They didn't receive, any support aside from those artillery batteries in the bluffs. And so these guys are writing about this in regimental histories. They're writing about it in the National Tribune, which is a paper published weekly for the benefit of Union veterans. And they're all making the argument that if we were properly supported, we would have won the Battle of Cool Spring. That might have been the end of Early's army, but ultimately, we know that's not really the case. So this meant a great deal to them, and they are fighting this battle, for decades after the conflict.
Yeah, that's very important. But as you mentioned, Early goes on to live another day. So, what happens after this? Early slips back in. Can you kind of speak about Battle of Rutherford's Farm, Second Kernstown, and ultimately for the
Yeah,
get folks the crowning with the burning of Chambersburg? I always
sure.
joke with my friends about up there about they cry about burning things, but being from the valley, they're gonna have a
Yeah.
reenactment here, probably coming up here in a couple days over this burning. So let's talk.
Yeah. Yeah. So basically what happens is the day after the Battle of Cool Spring, there's some small firing, I mean, between pickets and all that, those types of things. But what happens is July 19th, Jubal Early finds out that another Union force, commanded by General William Avrell, is moving from Martinsburg south to Winchester. And so when he learns that, he's really concerned because if you think about, where Early is at, so, you've got Cool Spring is here, Early is here, and Avrell is here. And so Jubal Early doesn't want to be sandwiched in the middle. And so he orders his men to withdraw to Winchester and then move south to Strasburg, to get out of that immediate perilous situation. And so Union Army, they end up crossing the Shenandoah River that following day, July 20th. And there's all kind of, I think, horrific scenes and transformative moments that I write about in the book as Union soldiers are walking over the battlefield. So they see soldiers who are half buried. I mean, the Confederates are not, spending a lot of time burying Union dead. So there's, these weird scenes of, arms and legs and body parts sticking out of the ground. But as I write in the book, this is not unusual. There are accounts of Union soldiers who aren't buried but are stripped naked. And I discuss how this has a personal effect on Union soldiers who are looking at this and saying, okay, I now have an additional motivation.
Oh, you
So
told
one
a
of the
story that in there that's speaking about a man kind of in his dying moments, his last hours, where he's hiding his stuff under a log so that
right,
he can't be found by the Rebs, and then his men discover him, later on. And it's really it's hard to even read. I mean, it's tragic about
yeah,
not that in his dying hour he's worried about being robbed, you
yeah,
know. So,
yeah, and so you have that fear. So that's Sergeant David Terry, the 123rd Ohio you're talking about. But then there's these other instances of seeing soldiers who are stripped naked, their bodies disrespected, And ultimately, the Union soldiers saying, "Okay, this is a war for Union emancipation, now revenge. Like I want to avenge the death and the treatment of my friend." But so that day, a couple things happen. So Battle of Rutherford's Farm, okay, happens just north of Winchester, and it is a rare Union victory. And so you have elements from Averell. So William Averell had about 2,500 men. Elements from General Stephen Dodson Ramseur's division had twice that many men, and Ramseur was defeated. Um, if you're looking for explanation, so many years ago, I wrote an article. I believe it was for America's Civil War. May that magazine and Civil
All
War
right.
Times rest in peace. Um, but I was trying to figure out like what is the reason that Averell was able to win against a force twice his size, and I attribute it to a technological reason.
Okay.
So Averell's infantry were actually armed, or they were equipped with Johnston and Dow cartridges. So a Johnson and Dow cartridge for a musket is you don't have to separate the powder and the bullet. So it's a combustible, all self-contained. You just ram it home and shoot. So they were able to keep up a much more rapid rate of fire. That kind of leveled the playing field. So Rutherford's Farm is a Union victory. The other thing that happens that day, of course, Horatio Wright orders a part of his force to push westward toward Berryville to see if he can find, where Jubal Early is at. And I write about this in the book, like, what if he would have communicated a little bit better? What if he would have pushed a little bit further west? But he pushes a few miles west. Terrible thunderstorms that day. I think weather might have, again, played a role. There's some Union soldiers write about a tornado, on the Cool Spring battlefield. One guy was actually killed by lightning that day. So weather was crazy. But ultimately, Horatio Wright doesn't see Jubal Early because Jubal Early obviously isn't in Berryville. He is pushed further, south beyond Winchester. And so he takes it that Jubal Early has left the valley. Like he makes these assumptions. He's done. He's going back to Lee at Petersburg. That's not the case. And so, 4 days later, you have the second battle of Kernstown because Early is learning. Early has a really good intelligence network. He knows exactly where the Federals are at. He knows exactly what they're doing. And he knows that his ultimate objective is to hold as many Union troops in the valley away from Petersburg and Richmond as possible. So, George Crook was in Winchester in the vicinity of Kernstown. So Early knows I've got to attack. So he attacks Crook, and Crook, of course, is defeated at the Second Battle of Kernstown. And then 6 days later, John McCausland's cavalry rides north into Chambersburg. And so when you look at that stretch of, about 2 weeks, 12 days really, from Cool Spring, you kind of have to assess, well, what does it all mean, right? And so Charles Dana, who was the Assistant Secretary of War, he was thinking about, okay, what is the ultimate goal of this pursuit of Jubal Early from the gates of Washington? And the ultimate goal in his mind, I think the ultimate goal in President Lincoln's mind was annihilation or at a very minimum, eliminating that threat to Washington. It was very clear by the time McCausland's going into Chambersburg and burning it, that the threat to Washington is as present now as it was a few weeks before. And so, he wrote in his memoirs that in his view, the pursuit, everything that happened, it achieved absolutely nothing. And, that's kind of one of the sad things of this is that all of these guys who suffered and died and, wives who became widows and kids who became fatherless, it was all in vain, right? And so that's why, for these guys who fight at Cold Spring, particularly the Union soldiers, they're writing about this for decades after the war because they want their sacrifice, the sacrifice of their comrades, to be remembered.
Yeah, yeah, that's really really brutal. And something you talk about extensively in the book is like I keep bringing up these. You do a good job of connecting the end of the story for a lot of these veterans, and even proving their wives had to fight for their pensions and even to get any sort of respect from the government. And then you find out it might be $8, which was standard, or 30 for disabled, or whatever was going on there. Just to add on to the back of the book, there's 7 appendix chapters that are really great. You've kind of already spoke to how your students have helped you composite some stuff, but there's the individual soldier kind of little blurbs in the back. There's also a great little article about by Jonathan Tracy about Thoburn from Cedar Creek, which is really great. And I believe he's going to be speaking as we conclude on Saturday, which is this big event about Cool Spring. So let's talk about that. July 20th
Yeah.
at the battlefield. Give me the address. I know you have it off the top of your head,
Yeah,
but
it's 1400 Parker Lane, Bluemont, Virginia.
anybody that goes out,
So
trust the GPS. You're going to get off the road and you're going to be on gravel for a while, but you're going to hit an oasis at the end, right?
right, it looks like the road to nowhere, but it is a road to somewhere, I assure you.
As long as you look out the side and see the river, you're following the right track there. So a lot of things planned completely free this weekend. Site opens at 9 o'clock. At 9:30 until 11. You're going to be conducting a walking tour of the site.
Mhm.
Do you have anything you want to say about that? Anything other than just come out and enjoy?
Yeah, I mean this is free open to the public, so there's no pre-registration for the event. Wear comfortable shoes. The weather forecast actually looks really good. It's like 81 is the high on Saturday, so I'm crossing my fingers that that holds true. That'll feel like 30 with the temperatures we've had here recently.
Yeah, I was hoping so because for those that can't attend, I am planning on going out and recording some of those or that tour. And the sun and electronics are not always best friends. So after that tour, though, in the kind of campus building that's there at noon, as mentioned, Jonathan Tracy will be giving his reflections on the life of Colonel Joseph Thoburn, and then from 1 to 2, be a little celebration of your book with a book signing and copies available for purchase. Correct?
Yes, that's correct. Yeah,
Awesome.
we also have, a couple other things I want to mention. So, in addition to the tour, John Tracy's talk and the book signing, our good friend Phil Spoggy will be there with the display of arms, types of which were used at the Battle of Cool Spring. And we're also going to have an exhibition of original artwork
Okay.
for people to look at. So, many of your listeners back in the mid 90s probably purchased copies of Time Life Voices of the Civil War series, which is that collection of primary source material that, again, kind of gave you an intimate view into the war. And when you open up those books, there are illustrations either of a battlefield. So, Gettysburg has one, Chancellorsville has one. They're either, illustrations of a battlefield or some type of scene. The artist that created many of those paintings, his name was Paul Salmon. So Paul Salmon, well-known artist in his day, he passed away a few years ago, but he, was commissioned to, paint postage stamps for the federal government. And so, I mean, you might not know the name, but you'd know his art to see it. I think he did the Sally Ride stamp a number of years ago for the Postal Service. When he died, his widow reached out and asked if the Civil War Institute would be interested in having these paintings. And I said, sure. And, we came up with this decision to put them on exhibition. We'll have some of those paintings, not all of them. I think we're going to have about 8 of them on display. But I mean, these are really cool watercolors. My favorite one is a winter encampment scene that Salmon did. So you have an opportunity to look at these things up close and personal. This is the first time that these things will ever be are ever available for the public to see. One of the other things that's new out at Cool Spring is in our exhibition area. We have installed a display about the care of the wounded after the battle, and we kind of again share some of those stories. Some of the stories I write about in the book, but put them in exhibition form and talk about all those fun things like amputation and anesthesia, and the legacies of those wounds.
Absolutely. Well, it sounds like you got a lot going on out there, and I'm sure many more things to come with future classes and success out there at Cool Springs. So appreciate you for your time. Congratulations on the book. It is fantastic. I think I've read it twice now between prepping for this discussion today, and I look forward to seeing you on Saturday, my friend.
Thanks so much, Casey. Look forward to seeing you as well.
Good one. Thank you. Have a good one.